I'm Nick Tyrone. Welcome to the Neoliberal Centrist Dad podcast. Some of you might be joining me from my Substack, having read that for whatever period of time you've been a subscriber. Some of you are coming to this fresh. If you're listening to this on the radio, thank you for joining us. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you for joining us as well. If you're joining us on YouTube, obviously please like and subscribe the video. That would be great for our audience growth. I'd like to start with a thank you to the Bloomsbury Institute for hosting this podcast, and also just to let you know that obviously any opinions, anything put out either by myself or any of my guests on the podcast does not necessarily represent the views of Bloomsbury Radio or the Bloomsbury Institute. With that in mind, the reason I'm doing this podcast is I've thought about it for many years, and it was really the re-election of Donald Trump that sort of spurred me to action. I think really because I think it was a pivotal moment that really changed the world. We don't quite know how it's changed the world as yet, but we're in the process. And actually, I'd really like to document that process as much as possible as the next few years progress. I think that, so I'll be talking to you like I am now on occasion, usually at the top, but I will also have a range of guests from across the political spectrum, right, left, center, no fixed position, to talk to you about the events of the day. Sometimes it'll be specific and very topical about something that's in the news. Sometimes it'll be more general. For instance, one of the big topics that I really want to explore on this that's obviously related to the re-election of Donald Trump is the rise of populism. And I think that this term gets really misunderstood or misused. I think one of the things about it is I think people on the left tend to use populism to only talk about right-wing populism, and I think people on the right increasingly are talking about left-wing populism. And I think one of the things that's happening is everybody's in bubbles, and I think it's harmful for many reasons. I think part of the reason it's harmful is I think most of us are in neither. I think the vast majority of people really don't. You'd never put them either in a sort of populist right or populist left-wing basket. And I think that trying to split the discussion between only being one of those two things is genuinely harmful. One of the things I do in my day job is I travel up and down the country, the UK, speaking to people, mostly business owners, a lot of small business owners, and actually they find a lot of the online discussion either completely mystifying or hilariously off-piste. So that's one of the things I want to do here is sort of try and get to a reasonable conversation about what's actually happening in the world. One of the things I'd like to just briefly touch on is sort of my thoughts on the populist left and the populist right. This is going to be very broad, particularly this time round. Just one of the things that I think that maybe the populist left does wrong, and then get on to what the populist right does wrong. So I think with the populist left, I think, and we saw this really in the re-election of Trump, is I think there's an assumption of a consensus that doesn't exist. And that exists on the populist right as well, but I think it's particularly harming the left, the center left, for instance, the Democrats in the US and center left parties across Europe, because there's an assumption that everybody sort of mostly feels the way they do. And one of the things I'm really worried about is not just that certain causes stagnate, that they could actually go in reverse. I think a great example is environmentalism. I didn't bring that up because, I'm essentially a green. I'm someone who really cares about the environment and man-made climate change, and I've worked on green policy many times throughout my career, and I really worry that certain organizations sort of doing what they're doing, so without naming anybody, but for instance, destroying works of art, my worry is that what that does is it's something for the right to point at and say, look, environmentalism, you see, this isn't serious, this isn't for grown-ups, this is something that affects a niche. This is an upper middle class concern. And I really worry about that because, again, I think climate change is one of the great challenges it will be for all of humanity throughout the 21st century. And so I worry that, certain topics get put in a bucket of, this is just for Guardian readers, and I think that's really harmful. And again, I think when I look at progressive movements throughout history, a great one would be the gay rights movement. I thought one of the things that they really did well is they understood where the public was, they understood where they wanted to get to, and then they wanted to actually create a genuine, lasting consensus on that. And I think actually largely they have done that. And I think that's maybe more, I think, where I would like to see hopefully left-wing movements sort of find themselves. I think on the right, I think one of the things that I get from populist right that I find odd, and I think it's infecting the centre-right to a certain extent, is I think they oddly engage in some of the language of the far left, which I find really odd. I mean, a good example would be WEF, conspiracy theories, MSM is an automatic term of abuse. I mean, one of the reasons I picked Neoliberal Centrist Dad as the title of my Substack and then thus this podcast is, I mean, up until 5 minutes ago, neoliberal was a term of the right. It described someone on the right. It described someone who, essentially just someone who liked free markets. And the fact that it's sort of become a term of abuse on the right, or actually being seen as neoliberals are on the left, is just very odd, because it sort of implies that people who like free markets are on the left, which I don't understand, particularly given that then it just muddies the waters, and when you're talking about what is right or left wing, it sort of starts to not make any sense at all as to who is what. I think there is also an anti-elites thing that is a big function and a big property of populism on the right. I find that really particularly odd because I think it's ultimately not really self-serve. It doesn't really serve the centre-right. I think that, and I think one of the big problems with that is I think that there's a lot of people on the centre-right who they're free market people. They want a smaller state. They want lower taxes. They want all the things that the centre-right traditionally wants. But they're slightly, I think, riding a tiger with the populist right. So in other words, they don't really sympathise with a lot of what the populist right wants, but they feel like that is their best route to power. And they're looking at things like Trump winning, for instance, and that seems to be proof of that actually being the case. I think the problem is that, you know, you're riding a tiger and you feel like you're in charge because you're on top, but actually the tiger's a lot bigger than you, and at some point he might decide to eat you. And I think that's the thing that the centre-right needs to learn about what the populist right represents and what they are trying to do. So with that out of the way, that's if you like the cause. Cause is the wrong word. The purpose of the podcast. But beyond that, it's to have very interesting conversations with people. I really want to talk to a load of people. Again, left, right, centre, no fixed political position. And my first conversation is with Tim Barnes. Now, Tim is a very dear friend of mine over many years. Tim is a Conservative councillor for the West End ward. So that's basically the West End of London. He is the deputy leader of the opposition on Westminster Council. He was the Tory candidate in the general election for cities of London and Westminster. He's a very wise guy, very good. We're about to have a very grown-up conversation about, well, one of the chief things we want to talk about is growth. How do we get growth? Everybody wants growth, right? But how do we get it? And actually, what are we willing to sacrifice? And how does growth play into the rise of populism? So that's all coming up. Thank you very much for listening to this and what's about to come. And again, thank you to Bloomsbury Radio and Bloomsbury Institute for hosting. And see you soon. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Neoliberal Centrist Dad. I'm Nick Tyrone, and my guest today is Tim Barnes. He is a Conservative councillor for the West End ward, which is in Westminster. He is also the Deputy Leader of Westminster Council. Sorry, not Deputy Leader of Westminster Council, the opposition. Apologies.
Quite right.
I was just imagining the Tories in power there, so apologies for that, Tim. It'll happen. It'll happen soon enough. Tim, I have known for many years and is a very good friend of mine, and we've had many great chats in the pub and elsewhere about politics, about policy, about all sorts of things that are relevant, I believe, to this program, and so I welcomed him today.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on Bloomsbury Radio again, and first time with you.
Thank you very much. So let's kick off with a slightly broad question, but I think an important one to frame the whole conversation we're about to have, which is we desperately need growth in Britain. It's a huge thing. How do we achieve it? What's in the way, and what do we have to do?
So this is obviously hugely topical. We are here the day after the Chancellor has given a much anticipated speech on the nature of growth and some of the things that she wants to put forward in her agenda. It's actually taken quite a long time to come to this, given the emphasis that was on growth in the general election campaign. And it possibly doesn't have as much meat on the bones as we'd have expected, given its 6-7 month gestation period, and indeed all of the time and thinking that could have been before that. So there are plenty of good things, right, in it. Some of the infrastructure ideas are very good, very welcome, and I would say that because many of them are Tory ideas that have just been continued or in some ways slightly pulled out of the bag and polished down again. And the one that's getting all the attention this morning is the backing of Heathrow and an additional runway at Heathrow, first for 60, 70 years. Absolutely good for the UK economy. But it isn't really a new announcement because there isn't any government money going in. There isn't any government impetus behind this. It's already been approved by the owners of Heathrow and planned for pre-COVID. They were just waiting for numbers to come back for the airlines. So there isn't a huge amount in this speech that's new. There are some things that are different. The emphasis on Heathrow, Oxford and Cambridge and so on does give us some sense that the government is serious about actual growth and not just about talking about levelling up. This isn't one of those things which particularly a couple of last governments have done where they started to cancel things because there was too much emphasis on the south. So we're getting a bit more information, but I still think we're a long way from finding out what this government really means by growth.
I agree. I mean, one of the things I'm really worried about is what is talk and what will actually happen in terms of action. I mean, one of the things we've had for quite some time is discussion of third runway at Heathrow. We've talked about Gatwick expansion, Stansted, you name it. Airport expansion's been on the docket for ever and ever. I mean, we can go back to Boris Island, all that. I mean, that was 20 years ago. So that's a worry. And I think one of the things I'm a little bit worried about is, to me, when I think of this government, I think of the rub against of two things. One of which is I could broadly describe as the Liz Kendall sort of version of the government, and one is the sort of Angela Rayner version of the government. So with Angela Rayner, we're talking about things like workers' rights, all that sort of stuff. And with Liz Kendall, we're talking about, get Britain working, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a sort of problem with the idea of that's my main problem, is that the growth agenda is confused.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
So let's just pick up one or two of those things. Your first point, you're worried that it won't happen. Here's a really good piece of news. One of the reasons, it's much more likely to happen than it has in the past. Why is that? Because the last time that the Heathrow runway expansion plans were stopped, it was these very same individuals were the ones that stopped it. Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves led the opposition to the expansion of Heathrow on environmental grounds.
Yes.
They seem to have completely put those aside. Now they're actually responsible for the economy and have seen what that actually means, and have tried to pull on their big boy pants and come up with some actual ideas for stuff that's really needed by grown-up politicians rather than the kind of yaboo campaigny stuff that they were doing before. So one good piece of news is they are no longer a bloc. The other piece of good news is that the government has almost no role in actually delivering any of this. It's already been approved. The private sector's there. Sadiq Khan is opposing it, but he's about as effective as a stale wet fish. So that probably won't really do a huge amount of it. So it's pretty likely to go forward. But that split you're talking about, is everywhere. Because talking about growth is surprisingly, and this isn't sophistry, it's surprisingly more complicated than you might think. Do you just mean growth for the whole economy? Yeah. Right? We all get richer, government takes more tax, we can spend more on stuff, we can give more away in benefits, right? That's one type of growth. Or is it growth per capita? That's a huge implication because of immigration. Does it mean regional growth? Because actually what we want to do isn't just grow more, we want to distribute it differently. Is it measured in jobs or capita? So one of the things that we still don't have is a yardstick for what these guys mean by growth. Which sounds perhaps slightly academic or like a made up thing, but is really meaningful because it changes depending on what you mean by it, what you'd actually do about it.
I think it's worth putting in just for listeners as well, who may or may not be aware. But if you look at the financial crash, 2008. So at the time, GDP per capita in the UK was about on par with the US. It was roughly similar, and now basically it's completely flatlined in Britain, while it's grown massively in the US to the point where it's roughly double what it is in the UK.
You're not going to use this as an opportunity to blame Brexit for everything, are you, Nick? Because I know it's one of your favourite topics.
I know, just the B word. It's on the tip of my tongue. But I'm not going to use it here.
Good, because it's completely wrong. Because the same thing happened with continental Europe, right?
Well, it doesn't.
And they didn't miss the UK in the same way. The US's exceptional economic performance, which may or may not turn out to be partly a bubble, is aside, right? It's stripped out the rest of the world. The comparison with the UK doesn't hugely help.
No, and also, given the flatlining took place in sort of around 2008, 2009, you can't really... You could try to make some
You'd like to blame Brexit for it, but you can't quite make the stats fit.
Precisely. That's exactly it. I mean, one could make a very sophisticated argument about, well, Brexit would have helped growth, but actually even I would struggle to make that argument, being as anti-Brexit as I am. So I guess I would probably say one of the things for this government is if growth doesn't happen, so if people don't feel better about their lives, at least their economic lives, in a couple of years' time, that's probably as much as they have, but certainly by the time of the next general election when that occurs, and certainly by 2029 when it has to happen, I think they're in huge trouble.
So I think I agree with that, and almost everything in the Chancellor's speech yesterday is stuff that's going to take years to have an economic effect. There is every chance, not least because things like Heathrow and some of the expansion around Oxford and Cambridge and the Oxford-Cambridge link, those plans are quite well developed. There is every chance that people will at least see building works, right? There will be, you used to teach, everybody did, George Osborne taking every chance he could to walk around something in a high-vis jacket and a hard hat. The next election is going to be hard hat central campaigning, right?
Yes.
There's going to be everybody everywhere going, oh, look, a hole in the ground. Archaeologists will get excited as much as builders because they'll be digging things up and finding stuff. It'll be great. Whether or not that's actually turned into anything that people can feel in their pockets is very different. And there you're back to a whole load of subtleties. And there the real problem is, as we've seen this week and last week, is the Chancellor's effects from the budget, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't the rise in NI. They'd said they wouldn't do that before the election, and they did. But the real issue was the drop in the threshold before you pay NI.
Yes.
And the real problem with that is that the people who are harmed most were the least or the lowest paid. Now, the lowest paid either means you're at the start of your working life, you don't have much experience, maybe you're still a student, maybe you're still working, doing first job, or it just means that you tend not to have any skills. And those are the two groups that are most vulnerable that companies can no longer afford and justify paying money to. And for big companies like Sainsbury's, like Tesco's, who are now laying off thousands of people and saying directly and in public, it was the budget what did it.
Yes.
You shouldn't underestimate. These companies spend no end of time trying to stay away from being in the public eye and criticising the government because they really just want to get heads down, just work on a business. The fact they've come out and said the budget has made us do this is really incredible. And it's the people who are most in need of a first job or most in need of getting back on the employment ladder who have been hit hardest. And when it comes back to your question, will people feel it? The very people who need it most are not going to feel it, right?
Yeah.
And they are going to be the ones who switch from, they're the guys who've been in play in the last couple of elections. They were the marginal guys who at one point trusted Labour and they didn't deliver, and they tried Boris for a bit, and now a lot of them are floating with reform. They're naturally Labour voters, but they're going to reform. Yep. Those guys, they've had a kicking from that budget, and they're angry.
Well, I mean, I think when I look at so Liz Kendall's white paper, the Get Britain Working, there's a lot of good things in there, I think. There's a lot of useful ideas. I think the rub against is that versus, I suppose, I mean, I shouldn't blame this on Angela Rayner specifically, but what you get is the NI.
You can blame it on our Labours if you don't blame it on...
That's true. The employer's NI hike, which was massive and mad. And it's a bit like, well, you want to create all these jobs, you want to get all these people working, you want to reduce the benefits bill, you want to do all that.
Yep.
Great. How are you going to do that when you're disincentivizing hiring by massively increasing employers' NI? I mean, that's one of the things I would say.
Yeah. And realistically, the other side of it, and in fact, this follows a pattern in other things, you'd think that Labour policy would be about helping those who were most in need of help in getting back into jobs. It's done the opposite. You'd think that Labour was about helping smaller businesses, particularly family businesses. But if you look at one of the effects of the changes to inheritance tax for farming, is that what they're actually going to do is kick out a whole load of family businesses and end up moving that land into big corporates who are going to do the farming instead, for whom inheritance tax isn't a thing. If you look at some of the other deals to do with investment, mostly it's big companies. The retailers that I was talking about earlier, who are shedding jobs, most are slightly exceptional in the sense that they employ a lot of people with relatively low levels of skill. But if you are in a big corporate and you are relatively relying on skilled workers as many do, one, you're not feeling that so much, but neither are the people who work there. And so it's the group they're helping most are precisely the opposite of what people think they elected a Labour government to do. And you find that on the doorsteps when you go and knock to people. It's like you'll find and hear phrases like, we didn't vote Labour for this.
Yes, and one of the things I'm worried about that we've talked about many times is the rise of populism. And the worry, what we're seeing is obviously Reform getting to 25%, sometimes higher in the polls.
Yep.
And actually, it's quite understandable because actually, in a sense, the logic is we tried the Tories, we were unhappy with that. We're giving Labour a shot, but actually, we're not sure this is going to work. And if it feels like that, this particular Starmer project is seen to fail, at least in red wall seats or places that are fairly vulnerable to a Reform threat, that we see that rise. So the basic idea is, well, let's give Farage a shot because actually we haven't tried it, so let's do it. And it is one thing that I constantly think about when I'm thinking about politics.
It's really the important point in all of that. Why I think what you're highlighting there is different from all the other debate. Right? This isn't a debate on who makes more sense or on policy or on which thing's going to work. The word you use that's absolutely critical is Reform is a popular party. It's populism. It's not about saying we know how to do this better. It's about promising people stuff that you could never do. They are pulling policies and voters from the left and the right and anywhere else. If people basically think that if they head down the pub or they're sitting in the hairdressers, this would sound like a good idea. And promising everybody everything is going to be better if only they're elected. Because isn't it just obvious to the everyday guy? Or if you only use common sense, like if you think of the language they use, it's like, it's just, if we get rid of these guys, right, and we just had some common sense in here, we'd fix this. So no, because this stuff is really hard. Right? I talked earlier about Labour going from being a party of opposition to being in power and suddenly realising they have to actually make some decisions to do some stuff as well as just opposing everything that comes along. You don't get to do that. You have to be able to do that if you're serious about power. Populists don't do that. They promise everything to everybody. And that is toxic. It's toxic because it stops political debate. And then if they do get elected and they are rubbish, then the cynicism just continues to pervade. It's preying on people who genuinely do have a tough lot, right, and for whom things have got worse, and are radicalizing them to say, no, it's a conspiracy, it's these people, it's the immigrants, it's the nasty people in power, it's the uncaring whatever, the people who are lining their pockets, most of which isn't really significant in anything that's going on, and therefore elect us and we'll just fix this for you. And it isn't that easy.
No, I mean, the thing I worry about is, let's say, for example, we elect a Reform government and people are still unhappy and everyone still feels like they're poor and living standards are not rising. What happens then? Are people reaching for Tommy Robinson? I mean, I know that sounds, in a way, that sounds quite melodramatic. But actually, I'm sort of coming around to the idea, because I would have said 5 years ago, there's no chance that Farage ever, really makes a go of this. Either becomes... certainly not form a government. I mean, what's Farage ever going to do other than get like a handful of seats? Now I'm not quite sure. I'm certainly not as confident about that as I would have been.
I don't think in the end that any serious political party in the UK goes into any form of collaboration with reform at a national level. Right.
Yeah.
You might have an area in a local council where there's a bunch of people who defected from Labour or defected from the Tories who you kind of know, and people can form a council group or something like that. But at a national level, with all of the variations that there are in reform, once it's in a position where it has to make a decision about anything, is going to fall apart. You've got people from the far left to the far right in a mainstream sense.
Yes.
You've got genuine populists. You've got people who used to be Tommy Robinson supporters and, if you went back far enough, would look like the BNP. And there isn't a way they come up with a coherent platform. It's an accumulation of antis, right? We're anti this and we're anti that, and we don't like this and we don't like that. And when they're forced to put something positive forward in its place, I'm not sure they'll have enough commonality to be able to do that. It isn't enough just to say we're going to invest more and we're going to build better and we're going to make everybody richer.
Well, I agree, but I'll give you a nightmare scenario. Next election happens.
It's always cheery. Doing
Exactly.
This with you, yeah.
I know, indeed.
Nightmare scenarios.
Nightmare scenarios. Okay, so Labour lose a lot of seats in the next election. Let's say there's somewhere between 250.
That's not a nightmare scenario. That's going to happen. That's a good thing.
Stay with me.
Okay.
Between 250 and 300. Let's just, for argument's sake, say around 280. The Lib Dems essentially hold somewhere around what they've got, 70. So between them, they've got enough to form a government, either a coalition or actually probably more likely a Labour minority, supported by the Lib Dems. Okay, so that's the government. Now let's say, on the other hand, that Farage gets enough seats, right? More than 100, right? And you can say it's not going to happen, but stay with me.
Okay.
He becomes the leader of the opposition. Imagine the platform that Farage has then.
So you're right in the sense that I'm not going to say a nightmare. The only bit of that I'm going to accept is it's about as likely to happen as a nightmare is of coming real.
Okay.
But if you get into that, I think that the further up the tree that goes. And certainly once the difference isn't about being in opposition. The difference is when you actually have to do something.
That's true, but the point being is if he's got a huge number of MPs and he is the leader of the opposition.
Well, maybe we go through that period. Maybe we go through a period of everybody going, hey, look, let's throw all the pieces up in the air. It can't possibly be worse than this. And we discover it can.
But what if that goes on for 15 years?
I don't think it will, right? It's very it's slightly lazy to draw the analogy of sitting in 2025 and saying, well, what happened in the 1920s 100 years ago?
True.
But actually there is a part of that where people find themselves in a desperate situation, and it's a desperate situation that. Can I take a side comment for a moment? Because I think there's a really important underlying element of this. We have become, in a media sense and in a conversation sense, enormously obsessed by the idea that it's just a question of if we'd had the right people in government at the right time, none of this would have happened. Okay, we're really fooling ourselves, because the big stuff that's happening to the UK right now. You made a comment earlier about the income levels and GDP levels having dropped compared to the US.
Yes,
the US is the exceptional bit, right? Compare it to our European colleagues, compare it to most of the rest of the world, compare it to the 20 years that Japan has been sitting in stagflation. Actually, it turns out that the real issue here are really macro, right?
Yes.
And aging demographics, global climate change, the rise of China isn't just significant because it's created a richer China. It's significant because the wealth difference that used to be between the West and and others, used to be the Soviet Union, it's now China, that's our geopolitical adversary, meant that we could buy our way out of trouble.
Yes.
Demographic change means we now have to spend more at home and we have less coming in. Climate change means we're going to have to spend more money at the same time that people from around the world who are going to be genuinely affected by climate change are going to be banging on the doors to come in.
True, but
and the truth is, we're about to have more costs coming in and less money and less ability to buy our way out of trouble. And that's true for most of the West.
I agree with you. And I think...
And we can't just blame an individual government for that. We have to have a more adult conversation about what we do instead.
I completely agree, but this is where I will reintroduce the B word. One of the things about Brexit...
Oh, you can say Bloomsbury.
Yes, Thank you to Bloomsbury for having us and hosting this wonderful chat. But no, the B word being Brexit. So what I mean by that is one of the issues with Brexit, I feel, is that for a lot of people, they felt that Brexit was Britain's way out of that stagnation. It's that whole being, shackled to a corpse.
I agree with that.
And all that stuff. And so one of the things I'm worried about is one, the expectation that has created that cannot be fulfilled. And two...
I agree with that too.
I think one of the things is, I think one of the things about Brexit was like, oh, well, we can be a lot more like America. And that was a bit with growth. I think one of the conversations I find constantly fascinating is people talking about Britain almost as if it was like America or a sort of dormant America. I remember seeing a debate about fracking. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about the whole debate was it almost imagined that, like, Britain had areas that were like America. Like, we had something like Alaska, which is 7 times larger in terms of geography than the whole of the UK, and yet there's like 1 million people there. So there's just all this empty space, and so it sort of starts to make sense. It's like, well, where are you doing this where there's no people in Britain? Like, we're a much more densely populated country by some stretch than America.
And there's loads of things. I'll tell you where I think your Brexit analogy does hold water, and it isn't quite that. But what the Brexit group was, and the voting coalition was like we've just been discussing, was a bunch of antis, right?
Yes.
We're anti the status quo because we've had a bit of a kicking and this clearly isn't working out for us and we need something else. That was, for many, many millions of people around Britain, a perfectly understandable and legitimate thing for them to do. I don't think Brexit was the solution for many of them, but the idea they wanted to knock the pieces off the table because they felt they had an unfair deal was entirely understandable. However, as soon as everybody no, it's not just we're anti the EU, we have to explain what we're going to do instead. Nobody had any idea. You had one end that was, Singapore on Thames, right? Let's deregulate, let's look at something else. You had another end where people wanted to go further and faster and stop, in some other form of utopian ideal. And there wasn't an agreement about what we looked like instead. This ability for lots of people to be anti a thing and to topple it and not have any ability to replace it is the same as the Reform Coalition. It's the same as the rest. We don't like what's going on right now because it's left or right, or it's not green enough, or it's too green, or it's not woke enough, or it's too woke, or whatever. It's fine. You knock it down, but you then realise you don't have any consensus about what you're going to do instead. And the political debate and the social debate either has to go through a phase of we go through that, and for the next 50, 100 years, we have some sort of collective cultural memory of the fact you have to put some constructive stuff forward, or we have to stop it before it gets that far, and we have to have a conversation about how you shouldn't be able to bring about huge change until you know what you're going to do instead.
But I suppose, how do we have that conversation?
I don't know, because the government that we have in power now was entirely allowed to get away with being an anti-Tory one at the last general election with no scrutiny of what it was going to do instead, because it turned out they didn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan for growth, and they don't have a plan for anything else. And Phillipson's plans for the education system right now are to remove every form of, comparatively speaking, old-style left-wing interventionism that the Tories have put in place to level up people by raising aspiration. Need extra maths classes because you've got, a high-performing young kid who's really good at maths? Well, they just got axed yesterday. 17 million, 18 million just cut. Think that the classics are all about posh public school boys? Well, they are now, because the classics have just been taken out of the agenda. So one of the things that links that to all of the rest is you've got to have hope, right? You've got to have aspiration. You've got to believe that this coalition that you're going in with, for whatever reason, is going to make things better. Yes. And the cynicism with which we're currently seeing every avenue and ladder of hope knocked away is just bonkers. And that's what's opening the door to the populists.
I mean, I think one of the things I read, I think it might have been in Conholm, it might have been Henry Hill, I can't recall, so apologies for not being able to attribute this correctly. But so this isn't my idea, is what I'm trying to say, but I thought it was a very interesting one.
You're doing the Trumpian thing, right? This is what I was teasing up. I'm
just
not saying
questions.
This is my idea, but there's a lot of people saying.
I'm just asking questions.
People are saying.
I'm just asking questions. Asking questions. But no, it was an interesting idea about one of the things that might have happened with Starmer and this government is this kind of idea, and it's I've seen it in centre-left circles for some time, which is this idea that, like, Well, when you get into government, all you really have to do is leave it to the clever people. There'll be all these clever people in the civil service, and they really run the country, and it will, in a way, and I think this is interesting, they sort of bought into the blob idea that was put forth on the right, but just reversed. So they thought, well, that's a good thing, because there's all these clever people doing all this stuff. And I think that might explain some of the paucity of ideas or plans?
Well, I think you've hit on a thing. I don't just think it's about the positive ideas, but I do think there's something really instructive in this. So back in 2022, we, my group, lost Westminster City Council for the first time in its history. And Labour took power in Westminster. And the similarities between the way in which that Labour group then moved to try and run things in Westminster and the way that the government has moved, I think the parallels are really strong, and I'm in a slightly unusual position because obviously most people don't follow what happens in Westminster City Council that closely, but you can see huge parallels. And one of them is that they'd never been in power. You'd have thought they'd be full of ideas about things that they wanted to do, and we're 3 years in. They haven't built started any new social housing projects. They're still talking about the housing units delivered that were the ones that we started in the biggest public and social housing scheme in London for 50 years. So we started it. They're taking the credit for it. It turns out that when they sort of came in to office, they didn't really have worked out policies, same as the national government. What they did was they turned to the officers, same as the civil servants, and they basically said, we're in charge now. Here's what we want to happen. You go do that. And not everything works out that way. The civil servants and the officers came back and said, well, we can't do that. Or don't have enough detail, or we don't have the money, or it's illegal to do that. And then they just shouted at them and said, well, do this. We've told you to do this. Stop obstructing us. It's like, no, we can't. And then people say, well, the civil servants are the ones really making the policy, or they're changing it. No, they're trying to do what they can do against being just shouted at.
Correct.
Right? The point of being in government isn't that you just get to be the ones who shout louder and issue orders like some form of totalitarian regime. You have to work with the civil servants and the officers to see what's possible and how it can be implemented. Excuse me. You need to be able to engage and lead the public debate, so you bring people along with you. It's not just about going, we won, and now we get to tell everybody what to do. And I saw that in Westminster in 2022. I'm still seeing it in this government that was elected nationally in 24 and into 25. And they don't have any understanding of how you govern.
Yeah, and I think that's coming across. I do sometimes wonder if that employer's NI rise was something that came from the civil service as a sort of like, well, you could do this.
No, there was I nearly said something. There was a shed load of things
done.
In Rachel. Thank you very much. It's daytime. There were a load of things in the budget that were very clearly things that somebody had said, we don't have any ideas, and the Treasury guys went, don't worry, we've got some stuff. We've been waiting for this moment. Let's just pull down that thing we wrote in 1976. And let's pull down some of these other ideas. And then they just went splurge, right?
Yeah.
The inheritance tax stuff. The Treasury is obsessed always with looking at the 1 in 100 case where somebody finds the loophole in the system, and they will damage the other 99 people if it means they can close that loophole.
Yeah.
And that's part of what happened with some of the inheritance tax stuff. That's partly what's happening elsewhere. Policy at a national level is always going to be a bit of a crude tool, right? You have to accept that because you've got so many millions of people with different lives and preferences and desires. It's never going to be everything for everybody. So you have to accept that there's a little bit of unfortunate elements that are always going to be there. But this was done with a huge amount of damage in order to fix a problem that wasn't really a problem. I mean, it was a problem, but the inheritance tax stuff, but not at like a national scale level, not in the context of the amounts of money that people are talking about. If we want to get back to the real issues, you knock on people's doors and you talk to them about what it is, and they'll say, my priority is health and social spending, and you go, great, totally understand that. Yeah. How much do you think the government spends? What proportion of government spending do you think is on health, social care, and welfare? And they'll go, I don't know, they might spend 10%. It's like, no, it's 2/3, right? This is basically what we do. We're shortly going to be a very large health service with a small government attached. We're at levels of healthcare spending that are realistically in government spending terms are getting on for twice what they were in the 90s when Labour were last in power. And that growth has come under Conservative governments and under Labour governments. If you want to go back to 90s levels of growth, go back to the conversation where you started with, can we look at what it is we've been spending the money on since and really ask if that's necessarily how we need to go forward? There are a whole load of things that have changed in all of this, but expectations and where the public debate is does not align with the facts. Didn't align with the facts on Brexit, doesn't align with the facts on what people think that the narrative is, and it doesn't help when you've got a chancellor who keeps talking about a budget gap of 22 billion that wasn't there until she gave 10 billion to the public services in pay rises without asking for a single thing in return.
So I'm going to close on a question which slightly puts you on the spot, so I'm going to apologize in advance.
I'm sitting down. Imagine my surprise.
Okay, exactly. What should the Conservative platform on growth be? What should it contain? What should be the headline ideas? I told you I was putting you on the spot.
So let's start with the fact that we are less than a year into a significant election victory for the Labour Party. Mm-hmm. And the idea that the Tories should immediately be rolling out a detailed manifesto would actually be insulting to the electorate.
Agreed.
And I don't think we should be rushing forward to put the details in. What you should do is be a constructive and grown-up opposition. So the contrast with a Yabu, it all sucks reform approach. There was a lot in the Chancellor's speech yesterday to approve. Airport expansion is one. Actually, the much more significant things were the plans for new reservoirs to be built across different parts of the country when we haven't built a new reservoir for 50 years. So let's celebrate those. Let's not oppose those. Let's try and work out, contribute and try and get the details right. There was also two references in that speech yesterday to entrepreneurs, both basically saying, yeah, they're good. But there wasn't a single idea about what to do. There was only reference to the fact that we think they're important, so we've maintained the R&D budget. The R&D budget is great, and we should be maintaining that. It's very useful, and part of the American myth is it's all about private capital, and actually a lot of the stuff is federally funded. So that's good. I have no problems with any of those. So let's not have a go at the stuff that isn't actually wrong. Let's start saying, yeah, but NI, the raise in NI, actually we can probably live with. The threshold was the problem. The threshold is the one that's having the long social bit. So let's try and be adult about what the policy should be and about the criticisms that we make and the things that we put forward in its place. So I'd like to see rolling back of the NI floor. I'd like to see more of the decisions being made about investment. I'd like to see things that are slightly less fashionable. If you're going to make the corridor, Oxford-Cambridge Arc corridor work, everybody likes the idea there'll be a train line. We also need to admit there'll need to be a road. There isn't a road that goes Oxford, Bedford, Cambridge, right?
Yes.
And there has been a plan for one, and the Tories kiboshed it. Well, let's basically admit we're going to have one too.
Yeah.
So that's where I see the issues being. And I think that we can inject some dynamism. But the thing that I'd really do is the bit that this government has been really terrible at, and that is to set a different tone. The UK is, by common consent from every agency, consultancy and academic study, this is one of the best places in the world to start a business, right? Startup Genome does an annual report that's absolutely fantastic, puts the UK as technically it's London, but it's within 3 hours of London, so that's like 2/3 of the UK, as the second best ecosystem in the world for starting a business. Every other study will pretty much do the same thing. Let's start talking about the fact that it's like, hey, Nick, you should start a business. Turns out this is a great place to do it. Let's do that. We were growing really well up until May of last year. We can get back to that. These things are doable because we did them. We are one of the world's great centers for AI right now. We're one of the world's great centers for whole loads of fantastic things. Let's encourage people to take risks and to be dynamic by talking positively about what can be done and not doing what this government, particularly the Chancellor, has been doing for the past 6 months, which is telling everybody how awful it is and how we're in managed decline.
I agree. I mean, I think that one of the mistakes is this idea that they can just say, "Oh, the Tories screwed everything up, and actually it's going to be rubbish for a while. So really sorry about that." And actually, the patience that people have for that is actually fairly limited.
Yeah.
I think it's very limited, and I think they're trying to turn it around. I think Rachel Reeves' speech was to some extent a sort of opening shot in that, and trying to say, well, actually, I think we do have positive things to say, but actually, it will be very interesting to see where that goes. And I think to close on this, I think that is the big thing really here is I think there needs to be a positive message. And that goes for Labour, the Tories. It kind of goes everywhere.
Can I just
Yeah.
let me?
Sure.
I agree, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, there's so much to be positive about.
Yes.
I just listed a whole load of things to do with entrepreneurship, but there are frankly amazing things that are taking place in the UK right now that are the envy. Now, my day job when I'm not doing political stuff is to talk entrepreneurship, and I go around the world. Looking at what people are doing in other startup and entrepreneurial ecosystems, and what's going on with investment, and what's going on in education to support that, and R&D, and so on. And I'll tell you the strangest thing that people in the UK wouldn't expect. The rest of the world, the vast majority of the rest of the world, doesn't look at the US and go, "That's the model to copy," because they basically think something exceptional has happened in the US, and it isn't copyable. They look at what happened in the UK. They looked at the way in which we aligned over the past 20, 30 years, private entrepreneurial instincts, government support, university schemes, R&D, and go, "Oh, we could do that, right? There's a set of policies in there we can implement." The rest of the world comes and asks me every time, "How does the UK do this? Where does it come from?" We are the example they're trying to follow. It's an extraordinary element of soft power, every much as, looking at the BBC and so on. And generally going about it, we can use that more. Right? This is an example that everybody else follows. If only we would... it's not even believing our own rhetoric. Americans are great at putting out a puff piece and then basically going, "Hey, it's true," even when it isn't. The UK, it isn't puff, it's fact. And we just need to convince people that this is a thing they can really go and do, because there's a heck of a lot to be positive about.
I would completely agree. And I would like to close on that note. The UK is a wonderful place to do business. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for joining me. That was Tim Barnes, Conservative councillor for the West End ward in Westminster. I'm Nick Tyrone. I'm the Neoliberal Centrist Dad. Thank you for joining me, and I will be back soon with speaking to someone. We're kind of working this out. This is a But that's the thing. We're freewheeling. We're being positive. We're going ahead. We're just doing it. We don't know where the road, that road from Cambridge to Oxford, we're not quite sure how we're going to build it. But you know what? We're putting the first brick in, or whatever you do with roads. I don't know about roads. I don't know how to build roads. That's not my specialty. But anyway.
Right, neither does Rachel Reeves.
Exactly. The first piece of pavement, whatever it is you do to build a road. You see, I'm not the guy who should build the road to Oxford or Cambridge, but I do know it needs to be built. So thank you for joining us. We will see you all soon.